What is the mind? What is the universe? Are they one and the same? Is one an illusion created by the other? Are these questions meaningless to begin with? Why even ask them? In recent videos, we have discussed the strange results of quantum mechanics and its implications. Mind is fundamental. Realism has been falsified, and matter doesn't exist independent of measurement. The scientific evidence has piled up and led us to this conclusion. However, through a simple deduction, we can see that these conclusions have been right in front of us the whole time. So without further delay, let us begin. Premise 1. The mind exists. No one with a mind can doubt this. Whether you think the mind is an emergent property of the brain or a fundamental substance, you cannot doubt that your mind exists.
What I mean by consciousness is the one thing in this universe that can't be an illusion. Consciousness is the fact of experience, the fact that something is happening. The fact that the lights are on in some basic sense, even if we don't understand anything.
Premise 2. The properties of the mind are not that which matter can have. This can be seen with the difference between mental properties and physical properties. Consider two things, feeling pain and an electrical signal to the brain. Are they the same thing? Of course not, because an electrical signal to the brain can happen without the feeling of pain. What we experience is a correlation between an electrical signal and the mental feeling of pain. But one can see the coherence of a possible world where one experiences pain without the need for an electrical signal. The atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel says, if a mental event is really a physical event in this sense, and nothing else, then the physical event by itself, once its physical properties are understood, should likewise be sufficient for the taste of sugar, the feeling of pain, or whatever it is supposed to be identical with. But it doesn't seem to be. It seems conceivable for any physical event there should be a physical event without any experience at all. Experience of taste seems to be something extra, contingently related to the brain states, something produced rather than constituted by the brain state. So it cannot be identical to the brain state in the way that water is identical to H2O. The point is that things like qualia are not physical substances. What we experience is mental substances like qualia, and then we assume they come from physical substances in and of themselves. But a mental substance, like the taste of sugar, does not exist with the physical substance. They are nothing more than the mental experience and all we really know. And then we just assume they correlate to physical properties. Therefore, upon examination, mental properties and physical properties are conceptually detached. No amount of introspection can ever reduce to the chemistry of the brain.
There's nothing about introspection that leads you to sense that your subjectivity is at all dependent or even related to voltage changes and chemical interactions going on inside your head. Okay, you can feel, you can drop acid, you can meditate for a year, you can do whatever you want to perturb your nervous system. You can feel yourself to be one with the universe, and at no point in that transformation do you get a glimpse that there's 100 trillion neurons in your head or synapses in your head that are doing anything.
But since we know that the mental experience is not a necessary property of a physical substance, then they cannot be the same thing, and the mental substance is something separate in all we truly experience. Thus, our first conclusion is, mind is not reducible to matter. Premise 3. Substance dualism is false. According to substance dualism, there are two fundamental kinds of substances, matter and mind. However, this view quickly leads to problems regarding the interaction of matter and mind. The internal contradictions of interactionism demonstrate that two fundamental types of substances cannot interact. If they did, they would interact via a shared property. However, if they share a property, then they are not separate substances at all. Either mind shares a physical property with matter, or matter shares a mental property with mind. As such, substance dualism becomes incoherent on close inspection and must be rejected. Though obvious to many, these three premises lead us to a conclusion that many find unacceptable. However, with a simple deduction, the conclusion is inescapable. If the mind exists and cannot be reduced to matter, and if substance dualism is false, then no other substance exists. Thus we conclude, all is mind, the universe is a mental construct. And without surprise to idealists, this is what the experimental results of quantum mechanics tells us. Matter is not fundamental in and of itself, but cannot exist prior to measurement, which was pointed out in our last two videos, and the properties of matter have no independent existence beyond how one chooses to measure them.
But there is no objective reality beyond what we observe.
What we perceive as reality now depends on our earlier decision what to measure.
Thus, the argument is not a mere a priori logical possibility, or just an interesting thought, but in fact predicts the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics. The evidence suggests the universe is fundamentally mental.
It processes and stores information at the microscopic level on everything we see around us. And if the universe is processing information, then it must be thinking. And it must be alive.
This would come to no surprise to many of the pioneers of quantum theory. Max Planck famously said, "There is no matter as such. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter." Sir Rudolf Peirce said, "The moment at which you can throw away one possibility and keep only the other is when you finally become conscious of the fact that the experiment has given one result. You see, the quantum mechanical description is in terms of knowledge, and knowledge requires somebody who knows. Now, is there an escape from this? What about property dualism? Could one just use premise 1 and premise 2 to arrive at property dualism? That the mental world is just a property of physical substances, and therefore doesn't reduce to its own substance, but is just a separate property emergent from matter. However, this is not parsimonious or verifiable, since we only interact through qualia on a mental level. If there is mental and physical properties of one substance, it is not parsimonious to posit separate properties that we do not interact with just to save an independent physical reality. However, more importantly, is that the mind cannot reduce to just a property. This can be shown in a simple deduction. Premise 1. If solipsism is conceivable, then a possible world could exist such that only the mind exists. Solipsism is of course the view that only your mind exists and everything else is an illusion of it. Premise 2. Solipsism is conceivable. Therefore a possible world exists with only a mind in it. Premise 3. Possible worlds cannot only consist of properties or processes, but must also include entities. Premise 4. There is no difference between the mind existing in a solipsis world and the actual world. This stems from Leibniz's law indiscernibility of identicals. If there are any two things, and if they are identical to each other, then for what is true of one will be true of the other. Therefore the conclusion is, thus the mind cannot be a property or a process, and therefore physical property dualism doesn't escape the argument. Now some would be scared by this argument because they would assume it leads to solipsism. But as we said in our last video, Richard Kahn-Henry and Stephen Palmquist point out, a theistic view of our existence becomes the only rational alternative to solipsism. One doesn't need to jump to the extreme idealist view that only your mind exists, but simply hold to the view that the mental world creates the construct of the physical world. Many philosophers have also noted that we are not in control of the way the universe behaves, and therefore it is not reasonable to assume that it is just a creation of only your mind. But if all is mind, then we have to deduce that it is dependent on a much larger mind, which is why theism is the only rational alternative to solipsism. Although this position may be rejected by many as unacceptable and hold to the notion of a mind-independent reality, the conclusion still follows. In fact, we cannot even conceive of a mind-independent reality without a mind. As Max Planck said, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness." So as we said, this argument is not just a clever thought, but in fact predicts the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics. But what about those who still reject these philosophical implications? Well, as Ian Squires said, it is probably fair to say that most members of the physics community would reject these ideas. However, the reasons would be based more on prejudice than on sound argument, and the proportion of those who reject it would be much smaller if we considered only those who had actually thought carefully about the problems of quantum theory.